This is Bendik Hofseth, one of my favorite saxophone players. He's one of our most iconic saxophone voices. At 25, he replaced Michael Brecker in Steps Ahead. He toured the world and released solo albums on Columbia Records. And now he's been appointed a knight by the King of Norway.
We've sold out this house. I'm going to enjoy and sip every moment.
We had a conversation saxophone player to saxophone player, and I got to ask him all the questions musicians want to know.
It's all about one thing, it's setting this free.
I want to take a second to thank the sponsor of this video, JodyJazz. They make incredible mouthpieces for every type of player and any style of music. If you follow my channel, you know that I only promote gear that I truly believe in. I've been playing their mouthpieces exclusively for the last 10 years. On tenor, I play the DV8 Star, and it gives me that focused and bright sound I'm after, without sacrificing fullness or depth. So click the link in the video description if you want to learn more.
I asked my father whether I could have a saxophone, and he said yes. So he bought me one, and I started to practice. The more I sort of went into the saxophone, the more I realized that it has some flaws. Because Sax was a brilliant instrument maker, and he had worked on in his father's workshop with flutes, clarinets, all of that. He had a combined goal. He had some fantastic ideas about creating an instrument that combined the brass, the wind, and the human voice. And in that, I think he was quite successful.
Yeah.
But he also wanted to mass produce and earn money, because this coincided with, industrialization. And in order to mass produce an instrument, you have to heed both to the professional's need and the amateur's need. If you're a professional and you use your body the way a singer would, then it's tuned too low in the left hand.
Right.
And the reason for that is, of course, that it's easier for the amateur then to play in tune, because he will squeeze the reed. But as a professional, you don't want to.
You want to let it vibrate?
You want to release the reed. And you have to release it in different ways as you go up on the keyboard. So that's why I had my own saxophone made, in order to see whether I could change that.
You were my external examiner for my final concert.
That's right.
For doing my master's here in Oslo at the Academy of Music. You gave me some actually very, very helpful advice after that concert, and when I got the feedback from you.
Yeah.
Probably the most helpful advice I got in all of those 2 years at the Academy. But I had sort of my thesis for this master's was to try to bridge the gap between composing and improvising.
Yeah.
To compose a little bit more the way I improvised, with the spontaneity and the flow of time that happens when you improvise that you don't get when you're composing.
Yeah.
And then also to improvise more like I composed.
Yeah.
To try and think about the big picture and form and all of those things.
Yeah.
And after the concert, you told me that my compositions needed a bit more room to breathe.
Mm-hmm.
It never got to land somewhere.
Yeah.
And what that made me realize, since I was trying to compose like I improvised, is that also applied to my improvisation.
Exactly.
And I've heard you talk about your compositions. You want them to have some resistance for the musicians, so they don't end up in this autopilot state.
Yeah. The issue with jazz is that the compositions are very often too poor. That they don't really have the kind of identity you need in order for it to give a meaningful strategy for how to improvise. I was trained as a classical composer, a contemporary art music composer. And that is not the kind of tools or craft or skills that you really need in order to understand how to compose for improvising musicians. What we really need is a diving board. You want to construct something that incentivizes the musician to really do fantastic things. But the way you construct that diving board has enormous consequences. whether they will fly high or whether they can do acrobatics or whether they go plunging directly into the water. And then I think the trick, for me at least, is, and this is consistent with research on how people listen to music. We know that the first thing that people listen for is familiarity, that this is something that concerns them or that they can feel at home and at ease in and with when they're immersed in music. They need to sort of be seen. But then once you've passed that threshold, they really want to be and they really need to be surprised.
Yeah.
It's a balancing act between not encouraging musicians to go into autopilot and do what they always do, and at the same time giving them a sense of being on home turf. And that's tricky.
That's something I have thought a lot about for improvisation.
Yeah.
Trying to not go to the autopilot, trying to stop and listen and then play something that will make people listen to you. Try to play in a way that sort of commands people's attention.
Yeah, I think also what it ultimately is about is to not really be an adult in that setting, but to be like a child. Because basically, if you could de-learn and take away improvisational strategies and just be there with the other musicians, they'll give you everything you need. You just, you know...
Just float on top.
Yeah. And but that demands good control of the instrument.
That's true. You're being someone who has been in Norway and the US, and I studied in the US, came back to Norway, went there. So we both have sort of some knowledge about the difference in tradition and the difference in the systems, the education and everything. I felt, at least my experience, was that in the US it's a lot of craft first, and then once you have your craft, your voice will show up.
Yeah.
Whilst in Norway it's more of a searching for your voice before or as you are developing your craft.
Yeah. I think both strategies are valid. It's easier to learn through imitation. But it's also like with speaking voices or singing voices, we are really individual, and it's possible to utilize more of the body, more of yourself, and put it into the music and the playing, and then you'll have your own voice. If you're force-fed techniques, approaches, strategies, it can be harder to release and get back to that sort of, that just natural presence of being you. What I found difficult sometimes in the US context is that the role of the musician is very much to support the soloist at all times. So there's a protagonist and an antagonist, right? That can be, for a European, sometimes a very golden cage, you know, because how to get out of that? To start to, like with steps, when I play with steps ahead, it's a train that's rolling, you know, and you can't just knock on the door and say, can we stop for a moment? And I want it to go in a different direction. I mean, you have to be on that train and obey the rules.
You know, you had this huge success in the 90s with the commercial success with the Nine in 1991 and Metamorphosis in 95. And I know for me that, well, I started making albums 10 years ago, but when looking back to the albums I made 10 years ago, I don't want to talk about those anymore. I'm always invested in my latest project. So I wanted to know what it's like to have albums that are 30 years old, as old as me, and people still want to ask you about them and people still listen to them and love them.
But I'm more and more observant and respect more and more that there is someone, there's a Magnus in the world, you know, that you can't control, that lives his own life. It's a public persona. And perhaps after 30 years, you can go back to those records that you made 10 years ago and say, that wasn't so bad. I can understand better now what I was trying to do, you know? And then it's a conversation between you and the material. But what's happening now is that this sort of person you want to be and you try to sort of control or influence is really out on his own. And when you get older, you sort of accept that. It almost feels like, oh, now I understand what I wanted to, you know. So that's a beautiful thing, and I think that happens with enough distance.
Now you're playing with the Forest, Forest band, Per Oddvar and Mats Eilertsen. And
Yeah.
what's your process? Do you write music and then find musicians that will fit into it, or do you find musicians that you want to write for?
I've chosen a very sort of Scandinavian approach to this. I've chosen to work with the same group of people over many, many, many years. I mean, this is how we are, because we're few people, and we so it's a collective effort. It's you know, and so of course their playing influences my writing, and also my playing. I know Eivind, my guitar player, in and out. I mean, we worked together for so many years, and I know exactly what he does best and what motivates him, what he likes to do the most. The piano player I use now, Helge Iberg, and also Helge Lien, they're much more into, you know, the harmonic world, sophistication, and so I try to accommodate for that, but at the same time also give them some resistance on it, you know? And then it's tied together with a sort of jazz comp or bass and drums at the bottom. And what this gives me is a tension within the group. If we all were sort of trained in the same tradition, I think it would be more formulaic what we could do as a group, and we wouldn't be as explorative that we can be in this way.
In the 2000s, you decided to take a break from playing altogether.
Yeah.
You started doing a lot of work as a leader of different organizations, NOPA, you worked in Tono, Siam.
It was a mix of different things, really. I had some personal issues in my private life. I wanted to, you know, have a family and settle down, travel less. You talk about my success in the 90s. Success always is a dangerous thing, especially in a small place, because when people are tired of success, they want to see you break down. I said to myself that I can do something else. You know, I don't want to struggle with that kind of resistance unnecessarily. So I changed path, and I was fortunate enough to, you know, be given some positions as a member of the creative community. So I started to work with copyright issues. And that took me to the international arena. I was elected European leader, and then world leader, and then I ended up in the United Nations working with as a leader of something we call the International Music Registry, which was going to be a sort of solution for the digital music market. And actually was a very good proposal, but didn't work for political reasons. So that was a very, very interesting journey, and it made me see music from the outside. When you work as a musician, you see the world from downwards and up, and you think, I'm not really part of this society, I'm just a burden, you know, but I love playing. But actually, it's not true. People really value what we do in a moral and personal sense, but they don't really do it monetarily, you know. And that's what I wanted to address. And it was a very useful experience in the musical sense. I hope I have become a much more generous musician, because I really think music belongs, of course, to the stage, but even more in the hall. That doesn't mean you have to sell out. It just means you have to respect the audience and respect how they value music. You know? All that work I did with copyright was important, and it made me feel good helping others. But I also realized that many other people could probably do it as well as I did. But to play saxophone, to be a musician the way I am, cannot be replaced. So I felt I owed it to me to sort of take that step and get back into the ring, and yeah.
What about these days in practicing? Are you practicing a lot?
And not enough. I think like most musicians, I'm waiting for those quiet days when I can really go into it in depth. But I try to be in touch with the instrument every day. And it's not so much to develop new skills, but in order to, have that sort of sense of ease with the instrument.
Connection.
Yeah, the connection, yeah. But also sometimes when I've had a holiday, for example, for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I grant myself that. Then I also feel that can be good because I can approach it from a different angle. I learn something from that too. But I try to stay in shape.
So I wanted to ask you about, the TikTok generation who make 30-second videos for TikTok with 30 seconds of perfect playing.
Yeah.
And but you can't hire them to do any other gig.
No.
Like they can do that thing, but nothing else.
No.
How do you feel that impacts the generation of musicians growing up? And what happens to the music that you and I like?
Well, that's a very good question. I think you're closer to answering it than I am, and I'm very curious about it. And I had an interview with a jazz journalist who's a lot younger than me about it the other day. And he had some reflections on that. I don't know if you agree, but he said what he sees is that people are retreating into sort of tribes, subgenres, we play, I don't know, progressive jazz, progressive rock jazz or jazz rock or whatever it's called, and, or we play free jazz, so there are sort of cults, to a larger degree, and that can be very interesting. What do you think, Magnus?
I think that's also got a lot to do with just how the algorithm works.
Yeah.
Because if you are very clear about what you do, then you get more views.
Yes.
I try not to be so clear, so I could probably go way more viral than I do.
Yeah.
But as someone who values the music and values doing a lot of different stuff, I want to experiment and I want to grow because people want to see all the stuff I do. So, but I think that's sort of what fuels that whole thing. The way the algorithm is sort of what decides what goes viral.
Oh, that's so interesting that you're saying it, because algorithms are very good at serving one purpose that's important. We talked about familiarity versus novelty. They're very good at making you feel familiar, giving you more of the same. But they're very, very poor in terms of surprising you in a meaningful way.
You can't the resistance.
Exactly.
What a beautiful horn.
Yeah, I'm glad you liked it. It's not polished, unpolished. So it has Yamaha keys. That makes it very easy to maintain, and all instrument makers can really repair it and maintain it. But I learned a lot from Thomas Inderbinen, the maker. The problem with saxophones is really this: there are 3 items. This here at the bottom, this. They have to be fused together. But if there's interference between the body, the sound body of those, that's when you get those tones that really peak out. And so it's very important that they have the same sort of frequency spectre. That's the trick. He made the mouthpiece also in the Bienen, and I think he sells them. I'm very happy with it. It's like I don't know, Dukoff, something like that. But
yeah, with the high baffle, or yeah. This is what I've been playing for the last 10 years. It's the JodyJazz.
Yeah.
DV. Have you ever tried one?
I've tried one.
What was your take on it?
It's very, very nice. I really like it, but it's too close to the link for me. I like it more open sound.
What about the tip opening of that mouthpiece?
Well, I used to have large tips, but I don't anymore. I think this is 6 or 7. If I have to use too much air in order to produce tone, it doesn't really have the impact, the flexibility that I need. And it's astonishing, because someone like Stan Getz, who sounds like, almost, when you hear him on a record, enormous sound. Because when you hear him, when I heard him live, because he has a large opening, and you can get that same sound with less impact. You can have the same impact with less muscle, you know.
Yeah, right.
So that's what I've always gone for.
At one point I was playing fives on this 8-star.
Yeah.
And now later years I've started to come down a little bit in reed strength. So now I'm playing like, this would be around a 3.
Yeah.
How do you feel that the reed strength impacts your sound? Like where do you land? And
yeah, that's a good question. And it's a balancing act. And again, I think it's individual, but I'm like you, this is 3, Ishimori.
Ishimori.
Yeah, which I find very good. Those and Boston sax, what is it called?
Boston Sax Shop?
Yeah, they're very good. But there are so many factory-produced reeds that doesn't make any sense to me. I need to go through 2, 3, 4 packets before I can get anything. And with these, I can easily pick 2 or 3 out of 5. So right. It's a huge change.
How long do you play a reed for before you, or do you have like a rotation, or do you?
No, I don't.
No.
And that depends. It could be months, it could be days. It depends on the reed and the resilience. And it's an organic material, you know. So again, it's you have to treat everyone differently.
Do you do any work on the reed, or do you just play?
Well, that's the thing. With Joe, he taught me all of that, and we spent quite a lot of time on it. But now, after I've started to purchase these sort of high-end reeds, I don't. But I know how to do it, and I teach my students how to do it. No.
I found that when going down a little bit in strength, I got more of that buzz as well out of the sound.
Yeah.
The ability to just play quietly and get that buzzy sound that turned into more of an airy and open sound with a higher number.
I think there are so many operations that are going on at the same time, simultaneously, that in order for me to use enormous amounts of air on top of fingering and all that, I've opted for a sort of a more convenient and laxer attitude towards openings and reeds.
Do you find it also helps you stay more relaxed here with the softer?
Absolutely,
yeah. So ligature-wise, what are you playing?
Well, now this is a Rovner. I really like their Platinum series because it gives some extra, I guess, treble to the sound. But I struggle with them because this mouthpiece is kind of small, so I haven't found the right size, so they break very easily. So now I'm trying this called Versa. And also, the first time I met Thomas was in 89, and he had then started to make what he called in German Donnerbogen, thundernecks.
Thundernecks.
Because he plays some extra sound bodies here, so they were really, really fresh and sort of gave extra depth to the tone. And that's something that he's followed up since with this. So
I play this the ring ligature, the power ring is what they call it at Jody. Yeah. I used to play this with the Selmer 404, just a standard silver 404 ligature. And it's a small difference, but maybe it's more something that I feel. But I feel that the reed vibrates a bit more freely with the ring, as it holds.
Is that sort of? So how do you tighten that? It's just
you just slide it down, and then it stops, and then the reed sits. Some people complain about the reed moving, but I guess it depends on the brand of reed and what you use. But I've never had that issue. It secures it really well, and
it has sort of padding for the teeth.
Yeah, I have a little plastic pad on top as well.
Okay, I use that too. I use the rubber ones.
The rubber ones, yeah.
They really give relief to the teeth. And I actually, when I can see when I play difficult music or loud concerts, then I've bitten through.
Yeah, you get a little dent in the mouth.
I have to change them.
This one has been on for 10 years.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Well, that's the thing. If you find something that works, don't change it. I mean, because it's one less problem to think about. That's how I think. That's why you started up by saying that I consider this a tool, and I really do. It's a starting point for music making.
Yeah.
But I think it's a very dumb thing in itself. And as I said, I think Adolf sax is is not as much of a genius as some people would like it to be.
Yeah, it's especially something I see in my comments all the time. People are really interested in gear. They want to know like what reed do you play, what mouthpiece do you play, and they go out and buy the most expensive stuff.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've tried these like heavy neck screws.
No, but I'm interested in that because someone made a different screw for me, and this is too small. So I struggle with
Yeah, because my original Mark 6 screw broke, and then I posted it. I posted a rest in peace post on Instagram, and then this guy in Germany who makes these contacted me and said, "Hey, if you want one, I'll send it to you." And I was like, "Yeah, it looks pretty." I got to pick the engraving, the stone, and I tried back and forth to see if I could feel a difference. I felt nothing at all.
Well,
So at this point, it's just a visual little
it's
jewelry on my saxophone. But it would be interesting to hear if you felt a difference with the
well, I'd like to be
heavy
able
mass.
to tighten it so that the neck doesn't go back and forth.
That's the main thing I like about this, because it's so big, you can tighten it.
That's what I
easy to
struggle with
tighten.
here. Yeah, this is sort of homemade, and it's not good enough.
I see you're pushed in quite far.
Yeah, because I think that the chamber note is too high in order to do the relaxed jaw, and in order to play naturally, I'm tuned higher so that I can play lower. 442, 443, 444, way too high, because it doesn't allow you to optimize the sound from your instrument. It's all about one thing. It's setting this free. And in order for you to do that, you really need to use your body, like a singer does. Use your diaphragm and open up the sound chambers in your body, like an opera singer would do. Because if you do that, the sound isn't limited to just the sound of a saxophone. You also include the sound of your own body. And that's when you start to develop a more unique personal sound.
And also when the body is helping you, you don't need the tension here anymore.
Exactly. What I focus on when I practice is to let go here. And that's from Joe, so that I don't squeeze the reed from the sides.
Yeah, bending the reeds to pinch it, really.
And that makes a lot of difference. And that's what I mean by contact. When I practice, I want to reach that level where I feel that I can play in a very open way.
I have so many questions about Joe Allard. I came from the George Garçon school.
Oh yeah.
He talks a lot more about making the like yawning sound as you're playing. Whilst Joe Allard, as I've understood it, talks more about like raising the tongue into the roof of the mouth and tethering the tongue to the teeth and all that. And I always wanted to talk to someone who got this firsthand from Joe Allard, because I've just seen YouTube videos of people saying Joe Allard says this, or
I'm an O person, I think.
You O?
I'm O. Like this.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. But I think Joe said a lot of different things to a lot of different people. He said, "Why do you attack the mouthpiece like that?" And I said, "Well, because I've seen other people do it." And I said, "That doesn't work. I mean, you have to work with your body, with your sort of specific circumstance." And he was very good at that, at sort of crafting out individual approaches to playing. People had different issues, so there was no sort of method of the perfect approach. You should never look at what other people do. You should, not try to imitate, because there's no right way or wrong way. It's your way.
George Garçon, he talks a lot about dropping the jaw, like opening that up. And I've heard Joe Allard talk about the chewing motion. How do you see that as fitting together, or is it two different approaches?
No, I think they belong together. But again, I think we're so different. The way our physiology is constructed. Some people have enormous jaws, and and some have. I'm a little sort of off center myself. So sometimes when I practice for 7-8 hours, I can get these jaw locks, and so I'm. This is something that Joe and I worked with relaxing the jaw, And also, it looks a bit stupid, but it's a very useful exercise.
Like a lot of Joe's exercises.
Yeah. And also, being able to relax the tongue, because the tongue is an enormous muscle. So this is going to look very stupid, but we practiced
like
tightening the tongue and then relaxing the tongue. Really, when you don't need it, you shouldn't use it, and it shouldn't be tight, because then it closes the sound chamber inside. So just so again, so this kind of.
But still maintaining a high tongue position.
Yeah.
And
but you can also, if you don't need the tongue, you can just put it back in its place, and it will sort of rest there.
Right.
For long notes and very sort of sound-based approaches.
And I guess that relaxation of the tongue also helps with the jaw muscles not getting tired. It's all connected, obviously.
Yeah.
But let me ask you about the lower lip, and that's the function of the lower lip onto the reed, because I know Joe has talked a lot about that, and I've watched some David Liebman videos where he talks about this rolling motion of the lower lip to cover and uncover the tip to allow for the higher frequencies to vibrate or not.
Yeah, I alternate a lot, also using the tip of the tongue, for attacks. So I go in and out of these modes, and it's become so ingrained that I don't reflect on it anymore.
No, right. But it's a lip out thing.
Yeah, lip out. Yeah.
I have a mirror in my practice space. As saxophone players love mirrors.
Yeah.
And I always look at my lower lip because it's more folded out on one side than the other.
Yeah.
And when I even it out, I lose the connection, sort of. And that always bothered me when I was younger, because I thought that was the reason I didn't sound like Michael Brecker, didn't.
Yeah.
But I don't worry so much about that anymore. As long as it's loose, and my lip's just not symmetrical, I guess.
No, I think that's the key thing. That very few of us have symmetric faces.
Yeah.
We all need to be sort of guided differently, because we're not perfect. Yeah.
Then you have these exercises that help us to find our place, our position and everything. And one thing I always tell my followers to go practice is overtones.
Yeah.
I'm sure you have a deep relationship with overtones.
Absolutely, yeah. I guess here again, Joe was very much in line with Rascher, in the sense that the aim is to try to keep. I practice a lot of octaves, also falling octaves, and in order for it, because most players push the second octave too high. It really you really need to withdraw and find the same constellation of muscles and mouth that you're using on the lower octave, and then just to let the octave clef do the job. And that's very hard, because your inclination is to push, when you're higher up.
Squeeze and tighten everything up.
And I can notice that with some of my students, that they're actually a little bit out of tune. They're playing a little bit, they're high in pitch because because of that inclination. And it's a physical law almost, that we need more pressure the higher the sound is. But the trick is to withhold that inclination and to, and that's when you really need support from diaphragma, and let that support carry you through, so that you don't need to do adjustments here.
Playing with the same embouchure, no matter what register you're in. You're not trying to change the embouchure. No. You're adjusting by maybe backing off a little bit in air, but increasing the support.
And then we're back to the overtones, because this is my focus when I practice them, to not change embouchure, but to still, it's sort of a inner audio guide, and I can hear the tone, and then I can find it in the spectre of the instrument. And I've talked to brass players about this, also brass players that play, the old trumpets or the post horns and those natural, and they can only do overtones. And their approach is quite similar,
Exactly. I talked a lot to Jens Petter Antonsen, a good colleague, and I know you have played with him several times. And we found that the more we talk about this, the more in line trumpet and saxophone is.
This instrument has all the possibilities of the brass instrument, of course. Sometimes I used to, not so much because it hurts, but I could take off the mouthpiece and just play
On
on the neck. And then you really get a sense of how much a brass instrument this is. And I've also seen players use, trumpet mouthpieces and stuff. And that, of course, works also.
Just so interesting to hear, the way you came into Steps Ahead, and like you've talked about before, not trying to be the Norwegian Michael Brecker, but come in there and be yourself. Did you meet Michael? Did you know him personally?
Yes, many times, yes. A very, very gentle and nice man. I remember Michael Brecker had a lot of problems with his jaw because he would tighten it. And I listened to, that was heartbreaking. I was listening to some of the very late recordings he did in Japan just before he passed away. And he really works so hard to get the air into that horn. He fights for each tone. And that's sort of also part of the allure or the attraction about his playing. That is, he really means it, But it's so much effort. That is almost, and it was funny because it was something that someone, or I think Mike Manieri or someone had brought just from the soundboard. So there was no reverb, no nothing, and you can really hear that it. And I'm trying to do the opposite thing, to use as little muscle as I can, in order to again let the reed do the work. And of course, then there's a lot of things you can't do, or that is harder to do. But that's part of my way into this. It changes me, it changes the music, it changes the sound, it changes what I can do sound-wise, and also what I can do with my fingers. And altissimo and all of that is affected by that. But I let that happen because I want to create as strong impact as possible with as little muscle as possible. That's what I practice. It's as simple as the speaking voice. When we speak now, I'm adapting to my social me. I'm being polite, but my voice is really down here. A lot of it goes, we're adapting to social practices. And I'm not saying that's wrong. That's fine. That's I do it too sometimes when I play with other musicians in an ensemble, for example. But it's nice to have access to this other more brutal, more sort of animalistic, more savage you. I try to teach the students, teach them how to have access to it. They don't need to use it if they have a different aesthetic, but at least they know that it's a tool in the toolkit.
You're not just a saxophone player, you are a singer as well. You do so many things, but one thing I noticed about your singing voice compared to your saxophone is it's very similar. The tone and especially the vibrato that you use, it's exactly the same. I can hear your saxophone sound in your voice, and I can hear your voice in your saxophone sound. Do you feel like they influence each other?
That's a very nice thing you said. I have never thought of it that they're. I mean, it's the same register, it's the same, but that they're similar in timbre. That's nice to hear, because I think that's what I'm aiming for. To have more of the body and less of this, because if you squeeze the reed, you close the access to your bodily timbre chambers, or the chambers that you can really expand the sound. And many sax players only play this. You only hear the sound of the saxophone, and that's a mass-produced item.
Yeah.
It's funny because I guess not a beginner, because the beginner will pinch, but someone who's never played the saxophone before and does this is probably doing the right thing.
Right.
It's just to do that with control, to just blow air and let the body and the saxophone do its thing. But it's very hard to control that sound.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm aiming for, to have as open sound as that, but with with the control that I need. And then you really need, very fine-tuned muscles. A very subtle embouchure. I don't need that oomph embouchure, but I need very tactile, small nuances. Long notes. Can I get, can I have a more open feeling? And then after half an hour, now I'm connected. I can do it. That's what it takes.
And interesting, you say the thing about the person who's never touched the saxophone before.
Yeah.
Because I have this is a sort of a plug for my Patreon, but over on Patreon I have a course in playing overtones, which goes over 12 weeks.
Yeah.
So it's one video a week and a little PDF with exercise material for each week. And the first week is all about forming the embouchure and getting the air stream before you even start playing overtones. And the first thing I say is imagine that you have never ever played a saxophone before and you just close your mouth around the mouthpiece. It doesn't pinch the reed, it closes evenly around. You're just closing so no air is leaking. So I have them do this.
Yeah, exactly.
Just blow air into the horn and then sort of morphing that into a sound by engaging and shaping the airstream. So
and this is where it becomes interesting because it's so much harder to de-learn than to learn.
Oh yes.
So when people come to me as students, they've practiced saxophone for many years, and they're completely attached to their approach. It's very hard to take it away and say, let's try something else.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and taking the time to talk to me.
My pleasure, but I am now tempted to go and take your courses because it seems like you have much more knowledge about this than me.
I would be embarrassed if you.
I don't.
But should we go on the stage and play a bit?
We're in a beautiful place.